Welcome back. Despite Islam's message of racial equality, Black Muslims continue to experience discrimination within the Muslim community and feel excluded from mosques and Muslim organizations. What can we do to turn the tide on anti-Black racism within the Muslim community? Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. Dr. Quick is a senior lecturer at the Islamic Institute of Toronto, head of the History Department of Al-Maghrib Institute, and outreach coordinator for the Canadian Council of Imams. He holds a PhD in West African Islamic history from the University of Toronto. Welcome to the show, Dr. Abdullah. So, your journey to Islam started as a young Black person in the 60s. Did it appeal to you from the perspective of racial justice?
Well, in the beginning, as an African American in the turbulent 60s, people were searching for identity. They were searching for roots. And when you go into West African history, you'll see a number of great West African Muslim leaders, and you see Muslim empires. So that really is one of the concepts, or one of the destinations for the mind of a searching young person. Also in the United States was the Nation of Islam, and this was Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, of course the famous Malcolm X. Mm-hmm. And then his teachings, that was spreading. So Malcolm X had a big impact on a lot of young people, including myself. And so from the beginning, the image of the Nation of Islam was there, and then Islam in West Africa. It was appealing, but it wasn't presented in a practical sense to me. The Nation of Islam didn't make sense to me because where I come from in Cambridge, Mass., which is part of Boston, it's like an interracial area. The project was predominantly African American, but we also had white American, Spanish, and other people as friends. So the concept of the straight out, black versus white, the white man is the devil, type of thing, didn't really catch on with me. That didn't make sense. Do for self, believe in the Creator, get away from the false notions in Christianity, that made sense. And so I didn't really go into it so much. I kept it, as part of the consciousness, and then continued my search.
So when you did become Muslim and you entered into the Muslim community and you started to get involved, were you surprised to find that racism existed within the Muslim community?
Well, when I accepted Islam in 1970, here in Toronto, I had left America and I was here. The brothers and sisters were very kind to me, and I got involved and plunged right into my Islamic understanding, and then after a short time I went to Saudi Arabia to study, and I lived there in Arabia. Now I was surprised in going to Arabia to find that there is tribalism. You couldn't call it racism in the sense of what we encounter here in the West, but it was definitely tribalism, and there was favoritism amongst the people there, and ignorance. It's really ignorance. I tell the people, a Bedouin in Medina, that I'm from America, and he said, "No, you're not an American. You're Egyptian or something. You're Moroccan." I said, "No, I'm an American." And then he says, "Okay, South American." So he couldn't deal with the fact of a North American. See, that's ignorance, okay? But tribalism existed, where they started looking down on certain groups of people, which would include, darker Africans, and maybe from India and in Pakistan, some other, they sort of looked down on them. So that was surprising to me, but it was reality of life. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until I returned to the West and got back into the communities here that I started to notice some real tribalism that could border on racism, within the Muslims, who were practicing Islam, in the West. This is where I really started noticing it.
Can you recall any examples or trends that
you
noticed?
mean, I started noticing that generally if you go to conferences and you see African people, they're usually calling the adhan or doing security. You very, very seldom, see them leading salat or as the scholar or something like that. Also, we noticed that when African Americans embraced Islam, or Hispanics, it was a good reception. But when a white American embraced Islam, it was like, paradise. and that person would suddenly be put to the position of leadership. Sometimes they would even let them lead Salat, and they couldn't even read, Quran properly, or that they become immediately scholars and famous people. That was a form of racism, because racism is not only a superiority thing, on the part of one group, but it's an inferiority. So this is an inferiority complex, where you feel that, based on your color or your ethnicity, that you are inferior to the other person. So it was the effects of racism in the community. And really, to be honest, the white Muslims who I met, they didn't want this. They didn't come into Islam to be on top. They came into Islam to be with everybody else. But it was the ignorance of the people, that effect of racism, which pushed them into positions that they didn't deserve.
Now, black Muslims account for arguably 1/3 of the Muslim population, and Islam, there shouldn't be racism in it based on the teachings of the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Why do you think racism persists?
Well, first we have to look at racism in the sense of the basis of racism is ideology. It's a concept of superiority and inferiority. And then you have expressions of racism, which is calling person by names. And then you have institutionalized racism, which is where the color or the ethnicity, affects the person's position. Okay? So within our tribal understandings, Muslims have forms of racism within their own ethnic understandings. For instance, in India, the ancient caste system, which was developed thousands of years ago, was based on the Brahmin people who came from either Germany or Russia. They were blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, and they conquered, parts of India, and they subjugated, the population, Dravidian people who were dark-skinned Indian people, and they set up the caste system. And the word for caste in the ancient Sanskrit, varna, actually means color. So literally, the lighter you were, the higher you were up on the caste. And that was institutionalized. And so that caste-type thinking even affects Muslims, even though Muslims are not Hindus. But it affects the way of thinking that the lighter is sort of like the most intelligent and the most beautiful. And so that concept was there. You also have in parts of Arabia, where some slavery did from East Africa, happened. It wasn't as much as the Atlantic slave trade, but there was domestic slaves that came into many of the houses. So they started looking at, this is in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. So they started looking at African people in a slave type position. Okay, so that concept is also there. So we have within our folk cultures, it's really our modern day jahiliyyah, ignorance. We carry this with us, and it comes out sometimes. And you'll find in certain languages, in Arabic, they use the word abd. They will see a black person, and sometimes some dialects of Arabic, colloquial, they'll say, oh, that abd, and that means a slave. Even in forms of Somali language, they say adon, which means slave, because the lighter-skinned or the Bedouin, straighter-haired Ethiopian Somalis, nomads, they conquered the agricultural Somalis, who were more Bantu-looking Africans. Okay, they're both Africans, but they conquered them and used them like serfs. In Europe, they work under the Lord. It wasn't ball and chain slavery, but they would subjugate the village. So they carried that with them.
So they literally refer to darker-skinned Somalis as slaves.
Yeah, adon, and the Arabs would say abd when they talk about a darker-skinned person. Although this is all relative, because when you go to Saudi Arabia itself, you find that there are many Bedouins, who are black, and within the cultures in Sudan and Egypt and many places, there are black, dark-skinned people who are original Arabs. So it's not the same color line that we have here in the West, but it is there. And unfortunately, because of mass communications, in the past 50 years, the Western concepts are now spreading everywhere now, and it's even having more of a dangerous effect on our own populations. So the racism coming out of movies that we had to go through here is actually affecting people, in the Muslim world. So that complicates the issue. And so now that the person who's an African person now who's coming into Islam has got to face, these negative cultural baggage and also the negative racist stereotypes that come from the movies that always has the black person as the second, class citizen or the, second-rate actor. If you have a movie and, that the black person usually dies about 40 minutes into the movie if they're fighting aliens or whatever, and there's a black guy in the group, about 40 minutes, he's gonna die.
He's always the first one to
Right, he's very rarely is he the hero of the program. Right, so that's a type of bias stereotyping racism that's still within our movies. Darth Vader, the darkness, the evil. It's still within the Western culture and affects people up until today.
So many Muslims, even locally in the Toronto area, but across North America and across the world, many black Muslims have felt that they have been sort of denied access and not represented by the Muslim organizations, whether it be mosques, Islamic conferences, Muslim students associations, and some have said, well, we need to start our own groups rather than expect that these Arab-run or South Asian-run organizations will represent us. It's not going to happen. And it feels like there's been sort of a bitter divide there. What recommendations would you make in terms of how to bridge that divide and help these Muslim organizations find solutions to anti-black racism?
Yeah, well, in the United States itself, because you have large black communities there, it is natural to have a masjid that is predominantly African American. It shouldn't be exclusively, but it's natural to have that, so that's not a problem. But in Canada, where you don't have large black communities, there really is no reason why we should be having these ethnic groups. But in the past 20 years or so, we've actually expanded into ethnic type mosques where it wasn't originally in Toronto area, but now you'll find for the most part the masjids are based on ethnicity. So for, the recommendation that I've been making is, number one is education, because the basis of racism is an ideology. It's a belief that one group is superior to the other. So we need to understand what racism is. We need to understand how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, struggled against racism, because it existed amongst his companions. Abu Dhar, one of his companions, called Bilal, who was an African. Abu Dhar was an Arab. He said, "You son of a black woman." And this got back to the Prophet, and he was really angry. And Abu Dhar said to Bilal, "Step on my head." And Bilal, of course, forgave him. But the point is, they were dealing with racism at that time. They were specifically dealing with it. And you'll see within the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, African people in key positions. The problem is we're facing with the Muslim community is that people accept Islam or practice Islam generally culturally. It's based on what my family did, not based on the actual traditions. So what we do is, if you go through a course of seerah, from an objective point of view, you will see that African people, Ayman, may Allah be pleased with her, she was the wet nurse of the Prophet, peace be upon him. She was like his mother. And she was an Ethiopian, a black Ethiopian woman. And literally he treated her like his mother. His mother died when he was very young. And so he treated Ayman, as his mother, literally.
And she was involved throughout his life.
Throughout his whole life. Also, not only Bilal, but you'll be surprised to know that Bilal had a brother. His name was Khalid, right? And Bilal had a sister, Ghafira. And most people don't know this. Okay, so when they think of Muslim, African Muslims, they say Bilal. Okay? Muhammad ibn Maslama, may Allah be pleased with him, was considered the knight of the Prophet, the horseman. Famous Sahabi, black African. Okay? Salim, Mawla Abi Hudayfa, one of the great readers of the Quran, was dark-skinned person as well. And there's a number of names, Muhajir, there's a number of names of early companions. And now if you look at it, and this is what we teach in the class, in the first 5 to 7 years, the Muslims are basically in Mecca. They're made up mostly of Arabs from Hijaz, and then some other people as well from the slave classes. They went to Ethiopia, and then from there they went to Medina. So when the early community was in Medina, the majority of the Muslims were Hijazi Arabs, either from Medina or Mecca, and there was a few people, Salman al-Farisi, Suhaim al-Rumi, there was a few other people who were there, but the majority were either Hijazi Arabs or Africans, because 32 Abyssinians went from Ethiopia to Medina when the hijrah, when the migration happened.
Okay.
So literally that early community, it was a common thing for a person to be an African Muslim, okay? There's no Pakistanis, no Indonesians, very few Yemenis, by the way, no Syrians, no Iraqis at that time,
So
okay?
African
And this is
Islam was quite
described by the Prophet as the best generation. He said the best generation this is my generation. Okay, so this is African Muslims now. So now an African Muslim comes into a mosque today, and the other Muslims from Pakistan, Syria, you know, whatever, say, are you a Muslim? Now, so imagine how the person feels, right? When his family can date back to the early period of the companions. Okay, so this is ignorance, and through education we can understand that African people have been part of Islam right from the beginning. And then, of course, North Africa, and then it is reported that some of the Sahaba and then Tabi'in, the next generation, from the Prophet's companions, right? And then the next generation, that they actually migrated to Somalia, to Djibouti and Somalia.
Maybe if we have more time in another segment, we can talk a little bit about the early period of Islam in Abyssinia, what's now Eritrea,
Okay.
And what later became known as Ethiopia, I guess. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Quick.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.